I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Welcome back to another opus of the podcast built to decolonize classical music. Support for this opus of TRILLOQUY comes from the New York Philharmonic, who is in the midst of their exploration of Afromodernism. Last week, I went to their big concert on this theme, which included an all-Black program of works by Carlos Simon, who's been on the podcast here, alongside composers Natalie Joachim, who you'll get to hear from in the coming weeks, and the late composers David Baker and William Grant Still were on the program as well. Their next show, which is sold out, by the way, I wasn't so happy about that, but good for the people for supporting Black music. Their next show is titled Composing While Black, which is also the name of a text, sort of like an anthology that highlights new music by Black composers from 1960 to the present. One of the editors of that book was the legendary composer George Lewis, who is actually today's guest. So in this chat, we talk about his approach to music. We talk about the book Composing While Black, his thoughts on great Black music generally, and lots more. Huge thanks to George for joining me, and huge thanks to the folks at the New York Phil for making the connection. Looking forward to more collaborations with y'all as the season continues. But for now, here's a little music by Mr. Lewis to get us into our chat. This is one of his more recent works for orchestra. It's called Weathering, and is performed by the American Composers Orchestra. Hope y'all enjoy this bit of music, and hope y'all enjoy my chat with composer George Lewis.
Well, at the moment, I'm in Stuttgart, and we're preparing a piece for the Donaueschingen Musiktage with an artificial intelligence pianist, a large orchestra, and Roscoe Mitchell playing the saxophone, who's an we'll talk about the AACM later, but I'm reminded, first of all, of something that Roscoe Mitchell said when they asked him, well, what is this great Black music? You know, and he said, well, we named it that because nobody was calling our music great. And so that relates to me the idea that when anyone says Black, immediately race becomes the topic. And that shows you in a way how skewed our perception is of what happens in the world. So for us, my co-author, my co-editor, Howell Kasidu, who is Afro-German and born and raised in Hamburg, and um, we didn't feel that Composing While Black brought up race as much as it brought up histories that were not known. I mean, the original title of the book was Hidden Histories. It wasn't Hidden Races or any of that,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So it was Hidden Histories, and these histories are certainly hidden. I mean, I'm spending the year in Paris, and we're going to be doing a Composing While Black concert in Paris. And one of the things I noticed was that the Black composer, or the Afro-diasporic composer, as we started calling him, uh, there was no real presence there, either historically or in journalistic accounts or in academic institutions or in concert programs. And so if you eliminate those people, for whatever reason, you're talking about entire histories that are absent. People like Alvin Singleton with these fascinating history that he's had, or contemporary music people like, I don't know, Regina Harris Bayaki, for example, or all kinds of people. So I don't necessarily feel that I'm talking about race. And what I often find is that people tend to collapse a very complex signature onto the sign of race. For example, there's an orchestra here in Germany, and they decided to do a series, and they called it No Concert Without Africa.
Mm.
And they said that one of the staff people came to them and said, well, that's racist. And the guy asked me, well, how do I respond? And I said, well, first of all, Africa is not a race. It's a
Right.
continent. Well, so it seems to me that a lot of the race talk is sort of another way of deflecting from the real issue, which is that these histories have not been spoken about, and we're missing huge source of innovation, and so that's how I look at it.
Do you feel like the unveiling or maybe unhiding of these histories as they manifest on performance stages, will that have an impact on audience? Will great Black people follow great Black music into these concert halls?
Well, they could. You know, I'm going to be a little contrarian here and say that I'm interested in having everyone come to the concerts.
Hmm.
And so for that reason, we try to make them available to everyone. And it seemed to me that uh, Afro-diasporic people are interested in these histories. And so I don't see any reason why they wouldn't turn up along with everyone else. And so when that happens, it ends up making a larger consciousness for classical music than we'd otherwise have. And that's what interests me right now is making things available. If people don't know they exist, you can't do much about it.
You just use the phrase classical music, and as you may know, one of the big dialogues that overarches this project, this podcast, is a critique and interrogation of the way that we use that phrase classical music. I wonder, when you use that phrase, what is it that you're referring to?
Oh, I spent a lot of time thinking about what that means myself. But I think a lot of the critiques that I've seen have mainly been based on how do we find a better word or how do we do something that's more that expresses a certain kind of diversity. Well, words don't really express diversity. Actions and social networks express diversity.
Hmm.
So classical music has, as it stands, this is the name of it, stands for a particularly restricted and narrow social network. And so I started talking about the creolization of classical music, which means that classical music has to recognize that it's not a monocultural form, it's not a non-diasporic form, that its history is intimately bounded with creolization. And not just when Joseph Bologna and George Bridgetower were doing it, but certainly all those people today, we're talking about having a new consciousness for new music. And so I think that's the thing that has to be changed. And so I'm actually pretty happy with the term classical music as long as it's creolized, and that's been my effort, and decolonized. So maybe some people feel that to decolonize classical music, we have to get rid of the term. But I think what happens is that once you start challenging what the term means, I mean, this is a Lewis Carroll kind of thing, really. Once you start challenging what the term means, that's where you start to get into the real discourses and the real changes that need to be done. I mean, you can always say, well, I've got my canon and you've got yours. But the real problem comes the real dialogue comes when you say, well, how do we make a new identity that integrates all these things? So a new identity for classical music, a new consciousness. I'm happy with that.
I want to talk a little bit about your identity, just to give folks a little bit of background on you. You come from the city of Chicago, as have many great Black musicians and great musicians otherwise. I wonder if coming up in the city of Chicago, or how coming up in the city of Chicago informed your early engagements with music, even if just as a listener in the earlier parts of your life.
Well, let me just say this. I would say that the most important thing that happened to me could only have happened in Chicago at that time, which was 1971, which was meeting the people in the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians and attending their free music school every week, which I attended at the age of 19. And there were people there that were younger than me, and people there that were much older than me. And it was being taught by Muhal Richard Abrams and Wallace McMillan, and sometimes Henry Threadgill would teach, or Amina would, Claudia Myers would teach, or different people would teach. And what was being taught was composition. And that was very interesting. They weren't teaching improvisation. They weren't teaching anything else. They were just teaching people how to compose. They were creating Black composers, which is something that we were often told really didn't exist. Black composers simply didn't exist, or certainly not. Uh, if they did exist, they weren't doing anything that people were bound to respect in the Dred Scott terms. So the process of using their personal homemade resource to create the Black composer, the new Black composer, changed my life. And that's something that I think was happening in Chicago in a way that it maybe wasn't happening in other places in the same way, although there are other places, collected Black artists. I mean, there was in LA, there was Horace Tapscott. There are all kinds of people in Detroit, there are institutions. But I was lucky to be in Chicago because they were concentrating on composing. And that's what I wanted to do. And that's what a lot of them wanted to do too. So since no one else was playing our compositions, we played them ourselves. So we learned how to play complex stuff. If Anthony Braxton or Henry Threadgill was writing some quintuplers, whatever, we look at it and say, "Well, what's this?" Or I could go to we'd be playing in the AACM Black Music Ensemble, and somebody would say they would see sul cello, and they say, "Well, what's that?" And I say, "Well, look, Tamika, read, show them what that means."
Hmm.
So I mean, trying to show each other how these things operated in a way. I talked about the AACM as an autodidact organization, but it was totally opposed to this kind of gatekeeping and policing that we find that affects Black music. And certainly part of the policing was the idea that you'll notice that we noticed when I was writing the book on the AACM, A Power Stronger Than Itself, which a lot of people still read amazingly. I was in Austria last week, and a guy from Slovenia interviewed me, and he said, "Well, I have one more thing, if you wouldn't mind." And he pulls out a copy of my book. Reading this in Slovenia, I tell you, took 12 years later, still reading it. So, but the thing is that you began to notice that a lot of the AACM musicians wanted to study composition, but they were sort of channeled into music education. And so that's a very important field because people would say, well, you can get a job, it's practical and all that. And if you study composition, first of all, who's going to let you into the program? I mean, classical music, contemporary music, composition programs weren't really noted for the high numbers of Black people that they let in. Although we did study electronic music with Richard McCreary, who was who studied at Iowa. I think he went there at the same time as Stephen Schick, and he eventually became an evangelical minister. But I bet a lot of the people who are his flock really don't know about his sordid past as a composer of electronic music. But in any event, that's what I'm trying to say with this long-winded answer is that we need all spaces, including composition, are potentially, Black spaces. And I'm talking about Black in the Afro-diasporic sense, which is to
Hmm.
say, not about Black America necessarily, which is, so that's, maybe I should stop there. And there are other questions you probably have.
No worries, no worries. And I really appreciate having had Renee Baker on the show to talk a little bit about the AACM as well in years past. But as you talk about the evolution of classical music spaces that are becoming more inclusive of great Black music, I wonder if that means organizations, institutions like the AACM are also evolving. This organization that was once the place is now not the only place where you can engage great Black music. I wonder if you could speak to the evolution of this organization as we move forward.
The evolution of the AACM, is that what
Right,
you mean?
right. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a complex topic, but I'm wondering what the best way is to talk about it. The first generation, as I read it, and people can disagree, uh, they advocated a kind of hybrid composition, improvisation, uh, um, way of doing things, a methodology, so that it wasn't like people were doing totally free improvisation, and it wasn't like, well, you could do a totally notated composition. No one complained about that. They try to do it. We'd all try to do it. So, and then there would be these things which would incorporate improvisation in new ways. So that was in terms of the some of the methodologies, but the methodologies also included, things like computer music. That's what I was doing, or things like invented sculptures and kinetic sculptures. That's what Douglas R. Ewart was doing, or all kinds of things that are very very diverse and sort of post-genre ways of looking at things. So as the organization evolved, a lot of people started to get their music, these ensembles played. Like Anthony Braxton had the pieces for four orchestras. He wrote like six operas. I mean, Muhal was writing the string quartets and the orchestra pieces. So people wanted to engage with the entire infrastructure of music and not just the part which some people felt that they should be most accessible to or whatever. So people wanted to stretch out and have the same kinds of experiences and support that other people did. But for the AACM, primarily the major source of support was the collective itself. So
Mm,
that was a very important thing. And other organizations that evolve over the years have had to face organizational issues around collectivity. Um, so the AACM was basically a service organization. You had the school, everyone had to teach in that if you could. You had the concerts, people put them on themselves. If you were playing the concert this week, next week was your turn to clean the toilet. So everyone was kind of trying to help each other. And so we served each other, we served the larger community. And that's how I looked at it. And so maybe organizations that are concentrating on service will do well.
And just for clarification, is the AACM now in 2024 still that brick and mortar institution alone? Is there a virtual aspect to AACM? What does that collectivity look like now?
The ACM never had a building, so it was always virtual.
Hmm.
It's an idea in the minds of the people who created and in the minds of the audiences who listen to us and the minds of the larger communities that were inspired by the ACM. There was never a brick and mortar component.
Okay, wow, that's good to know. Thanks for that history. Well, let's move from Chicago now to New York. There's an upcoming event.
But by the way,
Oh, go ahead.
before you do that, I should say that now you've moved to New York. One of the things that evolved in the ACM has two chapters. The New York chapter started in 1987, I think. So, and there's the Chicago chapter, which is ongoing, and neither one is like home base. It's not like the ACM's New York diaspora, you
Mm.
know. It's our notion of a kind of a diaspora, not as home and away, but as a set of flows. And at a certain point, a number of ACM members flowed to New York. And
Hmm.
so that's been going since 87. And so what you've got there is that it's not Chicago versus New York, it's Chicago and New York. And there's one ACM with two chapters. And the New York chapter produces its own concert series every year, has produced major festivals on its own. And so that has to be reckoned with. The ACM is a part of the cultural life of Chicago and New York.
Thank you for that clarification. And we also the another institution that I feel like I need to name is the International Contemporary Ensemble, which is listed as the performing ensemble for the upcoming event, October 25th. Is there interplay between the AACM and ICE Ensemble? How does that work, at least as it relates to this upcoming event?
Well, the first thing that happened when I got to the International Contemporary Ensemble, now let me tell you my own personal history with it. Um, the International Contemporary Ensemble sort of jump-started me back into composition. I was doing some pieces, but at a certain point, the combination of Melissa Smay at Miller Theater and ICE, as we're calling it now, not ICE Ensemble anymore, we're back to calling it ICE, which was a inspired move by the people that founded it. And if people can't tell the difference between our ICE and the other ICEs out there, and it turns out if you look on Wikipedia, there are about 64 different ICEs in the world. It's not just the immigration people. It's the Institute for Costa Rican Electricity.
Oh,
It's the it's the Institute for Culinary Education. It's the ICE trains that I just rode on to get here from Mannheim. There's all kinds of ICEs, and there's the Iceman, Jerry Butler. So there's a lot of things out there. So we decided we were okay to take our name back and to make sure that we knew what it was, because make sure we can't throw away our histories. That's part of the process by which people become colonized.
hmm.
So the ICE has been a major part of my life. They played this very breakout piece of mine, which was commissioned by Melissa Smay at Miller Theater, The Will to Adorn, which has been played a lot over the years. And I've written more pieces for them. Born Obligato, I wrote for them based on the Beethoven septet. They've played some of my open form pieces, such as Shadowgraph 5. So at a certain point, they decided to ask me if I wanted to be the artistic director. And my first thought was, God, I'm pretty old now. Can't you find somebody younger to do this? But in the end, it's been a great experience to sort of be able to give back to that community what they gave me. Beyond that, the other thing about it is the International Contemporary Ensemble has always been involved in nurturing uh, Black artists. Courtney Bryan, for example, or Tyshawn Sawyer would be two very prominent examples of composers besides me who've done this. And so that's come back that come back to them in remarkable ways. Courtney Bryan, the MacArthur genius, Tyshawn Sori, the MacArthur genius and Pulitzer winner. I mean, so ICE has managed to find people who've done extraordinary things. And so what we came to think about was something called the polyaspora,
Hmm.
the diaspora, but the polyaspora, which you think about the creolization of classical music and to relate that to the idea of the music of classical music once again as a kind of a as a network of flows and striations from one place to another. And so it's performed all over the world. Indeed, ICE has performed all over the world. And so it adds to the legibility of progressive kinds of music. So so for me, ICE, that ensemble is perfectly positioned to do what I would call of as a branch of the polyaspora, Afro-diasporic contemporary music. Um, so I think that's the basic connection there, which is something that, and if they hadn't already been doing it, I probably wouldn't have signed on to do this job.
That's good to hear. So the upcoming event with the New York Philharmonic in collaboration with ICE is Sound On Composing While Black. Composing While Black, that's of course also the title of your 2023 publication, the book by the same name. What sort of connections between the publication and this upcoming performance should audiences be thinking about?
Well, the full title of the book that Harold Casido and I edited is Composing While Black, Afro-Diasporic New Music Today. Oder, because it's bilingual, English-German, Afro-Diasporische Neue Musik heute. So what that means is we did not try or even want to try to trace the entire history of Afro-diasporic classical music, which in any case, we found it went at least as far back in Europe to the 12th century. So before Lusitano, before Bologna, for all these people.
Mm-hmm.
What we wanted to talk about was we set an arbitrary limit. We said after 1960, which is a point where you get people like Andile Khumalo from South Africa, you get Hannah Kendall, you get Tanya Leon, you get Alvin Singleton, you get all these people, and you get Jesse Cox from, and you get Charles Uzor from, it's from Switzerland, you get people from the UK, you get people from Montreal, you get people from all over Europe. So in that sense, what we wanted to do was to present a sense of what is going on now. I'm often asked that about the AACM. So the AACM started in 1965. What's going on today? So that's what we said. Well, this is a part of what's going on in Afro-diasporic composition today. And so there's no one strain. You find there's a lot of diversity. The pieces don't sound alike. One thing that turned up, I curated a concert of a similar concert for the Ensemble Moderne, which is like I like to think of the Ensemble Moderne as the ICE of Europe, the
Mm.
ICE of Germany, which is a very important, fantastic group. They're very well known. And anyway, that was the first concert I did of Afro-diasporic new music. And the other one, the London Sinfonietta, I co-curated one with Elaine Michener, where we did Courtney Bryan, we did Leila Du Gilmore, we did a lot of different people. But one of the things that turned up in the newspaper was that the newspaper people, some of them, some of the most prominent, like the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, said that we were searching for the black sound.
Hmm.
So, I do speak a bit of German, so I go on the radio and said, the black sound das existiert nicht. There isn't any black sound. There are a lot of black sounds, and so we wanted to find six of them. But you can't say searching for the black sound. And so the funny thing was the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, which is not, as far as I know, run by black people, was perfectly happy to try to tell us what the black sound was.
Hmm.
Which I thought was pretty hilarious, but they didn't see the irony. But in any event, so what we're not trying to promote the black sound or to say, well, this is black or that's black, because that would be like policing. And already black music is the most heavily policed music, I said, in history.
Hmm.
So we don't want to do that. So rather than trying to define, oh, this is black music and that's not, we just let the black people who make the music decide what black music is. And they're always going to be the ones that decide. And the communities from which they come are going to decide. And so, yes, so in terms of the Philharmonic and the Museum of Modern Art, which they're they're collaborating on this event. The event is being held at the Museum of Modern Art, one of the nice theaters they have there. And and one of the people that's going to be coming is the Afro-Swedish composer Teboho Monacottla. So, and she's very well known in her country with these huge premieres of orchestra pieces and all these kinds of things. And Afro-Swedish, I hadn't even heard of that, and she was not in my Composing While Black book, but I met her in Tanglewood. So there are people like that. So there's a whole world out there, and so that's the main thing is to be able to put that world out there and to look at the histories of each of those people. What's the history of Black composition in the UK? What's the history of Black composition in Sweden? The history in Switzerland? I mean, Jalalu Calvert Nelson has lived there for 30 years. So, yeah, that's what we're trying to do with that, really.
I appreciate your naming the fact that there's not a black sound. It reminds me of how I often use the phrase black communities with an S just to emphasize a broader version of that point. There's a lot going on out there. And with that being said, not everything can fit on a single concert program. So I wonder what was your technique in developing this specific program?
Well, first of all, I would love to have had a giant program with giant orchestra pieces and wonderful chamber music pieces and a host and a week and, and be able to do all kinds of things. But we didn't have that kind of budget. And so what we were looking for were pieces that addressed uh, a multiplicity of Afro-diasporic experiences, which we've already been doing from around the world. And there's not a larger agenda in there than that. So we're talking about usually the term that's used that used to be used was diversity. I became a little dissatisfied with the term diversity. I'm preferring a term that actually comes from contemporary classical music, which is new complexity. And I think of what we're trying to do is the newest new complexity. We're complexifying our lives, we're complexifying our histories. What we're doing is it's a form of home improvement. If classical music is one of my homes, what now I notice that the absence of Afro-diasporic perspectives, it's like a hole in the roof, and the rain is getting in and it's ruining the whole scene. And if once you do that kind of thing where you find consistent absence of the same gender, the same ethnicity, the same whatever, you start to find that those scenes tend to devolve. And the smart people leave them to go elsewhere where they can find the kind of creative communities that they seek. That also happened in the ASM, where the ASM was remarkably resistant to dogmas, and people who wanted to have dogmas, didn't last long there. So, so in this case, it's a form of home improvement. We go in, and the New York Philharmonic is helping us, the MoMA is helping us to improve our home, improve our experience of musicality.
As I walk around New York these days, speaking of the now, as I walk around, I'm seeing a lot of engagement with terms like Afromodernism, Afrofuturism, as they relate to the programming of other arts institutions. I wonder if you would consider this program a branch of either one of those, Afromodernism, Afrofuturism. Are there any connections there for people to think about?
Well, the original term was Afromodernism, which is a term we borrowed from the musicologist Guthrie P. Ramsey, um, who talked about that as being simply the experience, Afro-diasporic peoples and the experience of modernity and how to trace that. And there was nothing more to it than that. Now, everyone is going to have their own vision of what this is. My vision is the hole is to fix the hole in my roof.
Mm-hmm.
People have other holes that they want to fix, and so we can look at this as a form of what usually turns out is that people try to call this a form of identity politics.
Mm.
But what I'm looking at as a form of change of consciousness. In other words, there isn't any reason why Afro-diasporic perspectives can't be a part of this. And the other thing about it is you're walking around New York, and so well, I walk around New York too, but I'm not in New York this year. I'm in Paris for the year. And like many of us, we have a world audience. Lester Bowie of the AACM said that in 1968. Our job is to develop a world audience. So we have to sort of think more openly and expansively than just what's happening in our block, in our neighborhood, in our community, even our country. think about the relationship between what's happening in all the countries that are represented by that concert. Sweden, UK, Africa, all kinds of things, Nigeria. I mean, you have to think about all of these things. And when we do, we end up realizing that what we're developing is a new kind of identity. And if we're following Edouard Glissant or Patrick Chamoiseau or those kind of people, what we're talking about is a creolized identity, which they said, these people, was essential to maintaining creative depth. And this is what we want for the International Contemporary Ensemble. This is what we want for the world of new music. And we've been programming in a way where people can see that it's something that we're very serious about. And it's become a part of our identity. We are part of the polyaspora.
So, as we begin to wrap up, I wonder how people can learn more about you, your work, and some of your upcoming projects and performances.
I'd say probably it's just as interesting to look in these places, to look on the AACM New York chapter website, to look on, I'm starting to have a website, but I don't really. So it's just my Columbia University website, which isn't a source of news of any kind. So, I mean, I'm trying to become more newsworthy, but I'm overcoming a lot of reclusiveness. So maybe the place to look is on the International Contemporary Ensembles website, iceorg.org. And that gives a lot of the projects, the curatorial projects that I've been involved in. Um, I can say right now that I'm spending the year at the Columbia University Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris, and I'm revisiting my old association with IRCAM, the Pierre Boulez founded Computer Music Institute, which I worked at in the 1980s and made one of the first, maybe it was the first versions of generative AI for music and improvisation back in 1984, which was based on work I've been doing from 1979. So I've had 45 years of AI for music. And so the piece we just rehearsed today, this afternoon, was with Roscoe Mitchell and the SVR Südwest Rundfunk Symphony Orchestra, conducted by the wonderful Susanna Blumenthal and one of my artificial intelligence pianists. So it's a double concerto for artificial intelligence pianist and Roscoe Mitchell. So that I'm doing that. That's been premiered next week. Last week I premiered a piece at the Music Protocol, an orchestra piece called "Your Network is Unstable," which is sort of a meme connected with how, for example, what instability is a source of. I welcome it. I try to produce it in the music because an instability is the seed that nurtures change. So you look at something like I wrote a piece a few years ago about the Afro-German 18th century philosopher Anton Wilhelm Amo, and that piece was called well, Amo, that was it. And so, but his philosophy, someone named it in the book, a philosophy ohne festen Wohnsitz, which means without a fixed abode. In other words, a mobile kind of philosophy. And that really matches with our experience. The last thing I'm doing, and this is probably coming up in a couple of weeks, is I'm working with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, House of World Cultures in Berlin, a week-long residency called Always Already There, an incubator for Afro-diasporic new music. We'll have 8 members of the International Contemporary Music, 8 members of the International Contemporary Ensemble. There are 20 Afro-diasporic composers. It's an incredible array, and we're going to be having panels and discussions, private discussions and public discussions, and 4 different concerts, choir concerts. It's an amazing array of people who are coming. Leila Adu Gilmore, Jesse Cox, Jessica Ekomane, the Afro-French electronic musician Douglas R. Ewart. I can't name them all. They're from all over the Afro-diasporic world. So, and all of us are going to come together to talk about and think about and present examples of the future. And it's still, you can't present it all, but we're there trying to present what we can. And I think this is a group that I don't think anyone has ever done it like this. Certainly, I don't think in new music, I think people haven't done this. So I think it's sort of something that we're looking forward to. And I've had the full support of the House of World Cultures, including the intendant, the director, Bonaventure and Dikung, who the one of the most important curators of our time after Oakley and Wazer. So someone whose name that, for example, the Museum of Modern Art people would certainly recognize because he was involved with Documenta. He started the Savvy Contemporary Gallery in which they did music. They did contemporary music. They did Benjamin Patterson. They did a week-long series of Julius Eastman. And they recently have done Mia Masaoka for a whole week of installation performances. So they do amazing things. And so, yeah, that's a nutshell of what I'm doing. So if you look on the House of World Culture's website, you can find out about that. And if you're in Berlin, I'd say if you can get there, just come on over and check us out. It's going to be fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, huge thanks to you, to the New York Phil, to the Museum of Modern Art, to ICE, and everyone involved in this upcoming performance. I'm definitely looking forward. The last thing I wanted to ask you, I wanted to circle back around to audiences. I wonder what guidance you would give folks trying to help communities of people, Black communities and other communities, engage this approach to classical music. And I ask that because as unfamiliar as, let's say, Beethoven may be to many people, there are still those cultural connections that could be made to help build, I'll say, some artistic rapport so that a person doesn't feel like they're going in completely blind. This upcoming concert on the 25th, however, is very different. And the music, not only the composers, but the approach to the musicking can be very unfamiliar to people who aren't really engaged in this art making as a part of their living, as a part of their careers. So again, I wonder what guidance you might give to folks who are so-called laymen who might be interested in engaging this more contemporary approach to classical music.
Well, people engage contemporary approaches to all kinds of things. I mean, let me put it this way. Um, when I wrote my book on the AACM, because a lot of people thought that it was going to be about something they thought of as jazz, I was advised to tone it down in terms of the use of certain words, like academic big words, as they call them. And I noticed that many of the publications that were involved in this, they had critics who were saying they were very critical of like critical theory because people use big words like synecdoche or whatever, and that was supposed to be something that wasn't connected with like jazz. And people told me that, and I said, well, I'm just going to put out what I want, and someone else, maybe you, can write the cliff notes later. But the idea is that, and the musicians thought it was great because they said, finally, here's someone who's not patronizing us.
Hmm.
And so at some point, I think that we underestimate audiences at our peril. The idea that somehow people need all kinds of extensive handholding. The main thing is they just need to show up. And if we can get them to show up, then they can ask questions, they can listen, they can feel free to. What I do when I present concerts, I say, well, look, it's question time. Do you have questions or complaints? And so that becomes something where we can talk about how people feel about the music. And I haven't found this to be something where people just say, "Oh, I'm a layman. I don't know anything about this." Most people don't want to be. They want to think that they know, which is great because they do know. And so it's not any different from any other kind of music. It's just that the best thing to do is kind of come in with a questioning attitude. As you do anything else. Well, what's going on here? Why are these people doing that? And a lot of the people we're talking about, I mean, I didn't grow up with Beethoven. So I mean, like I didn't, that was something I had heard about, sure. But so in the end, I would say that a lot of what I think this concern is, it's less of an issue once you realize, because just expressing that concern puts people in a defensive attitude of fear. And we're trying to put people in a welcoming attitude of, well, how do we uh, promote new experiences? Maybe what I tell people, and this is the last thing I could probably say on this subject, is that um, I want to come out of the concert with the attitude of, wow, I've never heard anything like that before. I've never heard anything like that before. And then, and that was really different, you know. And then a few minutes later, or maybe they wake up in the middle of the night and they say, that was really different. I wonder what else could be different around here. And that's why people try to suppress new art, new music, or try to minimize it, try to patronize people, whatever, because it does present almost immediately the idea that we can question and that things don't have to be like they are. So if they listen to this music and they realize that things don't have to be like we thought they could be, that seems like a pretty liberatory thing to take away from some music.
That was the Black Box Ensemble in a performance of a work called Arcades by George Lewis. As you can hear there, and in the clip that preceded our dialogue, Weathering, as performed by ACO, he's definitely on the more modern or contemporary side of things, which isn't always celebrated when it comes to Black folks and Black composers. We've had composers like Edgar Varese and George Crumb and John Cage who have put out more experimental things in the past, and we celebrate that and sort of create a genre around their work. But it's important to remember that Black folks have the same legacy, thanks to institutions like the AACM, which George and I talked about, and composers like George himself. So it was an honor to get to chat with him. Hope you enjoyed our interview and hope you'll check out some of the things that he's doing out there. I'll have some links in the description for you. Well, for today's Trilloquy, I just want to briefly recount my experience at the Afromodernism concert by the New York Phil last week. So I'll start by saying that I actually knew about this concert. I find myself playing catch up oftentimes when it comes to the when and the where of concerts around the city. But they made sure to advertise this concert everywhere, including up here in Harlem. I saw the Afromodernism posters on 125th and even higher. So I had no excuse, and neither did other Black folks. The crowd was definitely darker than I'm used to seeing it, which, I'll say is a good thing for folks who are interested in that kind of music, that sort of musicking. Nothing wrong with expanding your palette of experiences, even if it is, a downtown institution. I didn't mention him earlier, but cellist Seth Parker Woods was also featured on the concert as a cello soloist. He's been on Trilloquy as well, if you remember. So all in all, Black artistry was on full display, and I think the New York Philharmonic did a really great job of putting everything together in that way. A lot of people have been saying that this concert should just be a part of their regular programming, and I agree. We don't have to have a special themed night to have an all-Black program, because you don't need a special themed night to have an all-white program, right? That's just the practice. That's the status quo. So, that is maybe not a critique, but just something that I'll throw out there that I've been hearing that I agree with. We should explore what it looks like for a concert like this to be the norm and not a special sort of thing. And this isn't February, so even though October is Black History Month in Europe, I know in England, but anyway, that concert remains. But the other conversation that remains is the fact that the New York Phil to this day still only has one Black player, at least one tenured Black player. Shout out to Anthony McGill. But there should be more. My feelings about orchestras have evolved over the years. During 2020, I used to say that we just need to burn them all down, just like the third precinct in Minneapolis was burned down. But these days, I'm not necessarily saying that they have to go away. But if they are going to exist, and if we are going to find a use for them as we move forward in society, we got to keep pressing them to ditch the traditional measures that are holding back progress. And among those measures, in my opinion, is the way orchestras recruit and hire musicians. If you want more Black musicians in your orchestra, hire more Black musicians. It's that easy. If you don't, then don't. But let's make the delineation clear and find out who's who and what's what as far as what these big orchestras want to do regarding their personnel. Again, shout out to Anthony McGill. He got the biggest applause from the audience when principal musicians were asked to stand up at the end of the concert. But it can't just be one. especially for an organization in New York City that's invested so much into programming, and to get more diverse audiences, folks like me there in the mix. It just has to be done. It's called the New York Philharmonic. So when I look on stage, I should see a body of musicians that to me is representative of New York. And right now it's not that. And it's a conversation that I hope they're continuing to have inside their walls. Item number two is the way we treat composers within the context of orchestral concerts. So typically, when a piece of music is done, the conductor will ask key players in the orchestra to stand. These are folks who may have had a solo in the piece or a really significant musical contribution in the piece of music, and then the whole orchestra will stand up. Well, I think this should change if there are composers in the room. The first two works on the program were written by Carlos Simon and Natalie Joachim, respectively, and it felt like they were almost forgotten about when it came time to celebrate the performance when the applause came up. And this is no shade to the conductor. Shout out to Thomas Wilkins. I just think conductors aren't used to having composers in the room because we've centered dead white men for so long in our orchestral programming. Ultimately, I think orchestra concerts should center living composers. That's just that. As much as I loved the David Baker and the William Grant Still works that were on that concert, an opportunity to support two more living composers was missed at the end of the day. And we can't pretend that the literature isn't out there. We can't pretend like the composers aren't out there. And, again, I'm really trying to reiterate the fact that I'm not throwing mud or throwing shade here. I'm just sharing what I think the next step is for the most traditional orchestras like the New York Phil to do what they can do toward the long-term goal of decolonization. Centering living composers in itself will not decolonize classical music, but it'll be a huge step in that direction. So if you're involved in an orchestra concert as a conductor, as a musician, and administrator, or even as an audience member, shine a light on the composer first. Point them out in the crowd and invite them on stage when the piece is done. Musicians, don't stand up until the conductor offers some applause to the composer who is present. Let's honor those who create these musical experiences for us first, and hold celebration for the folks who realize the creation of that musical experience until after the creators are honored. You see, there's a difference between creating a musical experience and realizing a musical experience. I believe that we need to celebrate and honor those creators first, and then move on to the musicians, the conductor, the orchestra. It sounds like a small thing, which it is for some people, but for others, it's a huge thing. And think, that I think a change like this can inspire a new perspective among anyone who engages orchestral music. I still think if I go out on the sidewalk right now and ask a person about a composer, name a composer, they're probably going to say Beethoven or Mozart. We have spent so long centering dead people in the way that we conceive classical music that something like this, really centering the living composer in the concert experience, can shift thinking. I think it's a perspective that cultivates consciousness around the importance of living composers and the impact that they can have on the decolonization of classical music across the board. That's my sermon for today. Thank y'all again for listening to Freedom. I'll see y'all again soon, or I'll talk to y'all again soon. Stay dangerous.